What if I told you that one of the most accurate depictions of sexual coercion and rape culture released in recent years is a horror film about a magic wishing stick? You would probably think I am overthinking it, but stay with me. Because I actually don't like most horror films. Gore for the sake of gore has never really interested me, and jump scares designed to make you spill your drink don't really do much for me either. However, psychological horror is different. At its best, psychological horror isn't about fear at all. It is about diagnosis. For example, Black Swan isn't a film about a ballerina turning into a bird. It's a film about perfectionism, self-destruction, and what happens when a woman's identity collapses under impossible expectations. Strip away the flowers and rituals of Midsummer, and you are left with a film about grief, emotional neglect, and desperate need to be seen by another person. Similarly, strip away the science fiction of Get Out, and what remains is one of the sharpest examinations of racism in modern American cinema. That's what psychological horror does better than any other film genre. Curry Barker's Obsession, on the surface, is a supernatural horror film about a magical object and an increasingly disturbing relationship. But audiences seem to be responding to something deeper than the plot itself. The film has become a massive success, earning millions on a tiny budget and generating the kind of engagement that most horror films only dream of achieving. People aren't just watching it, they are arguing about it, dissecting it, and returning to it. And I think that's because they are sensing something beneath the surface, even if they don't have a language for it yet. Because obsession isn't really about magic, it's about consent, coercion, and entitlement. It's about the fantasy of the nice guy who believes his feelings give him a claim over another person. And it's about what happens when someone's autonomy is taken from them long before any physical act ever does. The horror in Obsession is not a supernatural element. The horror is that the film understands some things most people still don't. Violations don't begin when someone touches your body. They begin when someone decides that your choices no longer matter. So that is what we are going to talk about today. So the film begins with the main protagonist Bear Daly standing in front of a mirror, rehearsing a confession that he will never make.
Nikki, I think we should grab a drink sometime.
So he's practicing what he's going to say to Nikki, running through the words, adjusting the tone, imagining how the conversation is supposed to go. And then he goes to work and says absolutely nothing. So this is who we meet at first. Not a villain, not someone who immediately sets off alarm bells. It is not someone who you get some sinister vibes from. This is just a shy, quietly lovesick young man who works at a music store, has a best friend named Ian, and has been carrying feelings for his co-worker for far longer than probably healthy. Curry Barker frames him with genuine warmth in these opening scenes. The camera likes Bear, it stays close to him, it understands him. And because the camera understands him, we do too. And almost immediately, almost without realizing it, we find ourselves on his side. And this is not an accident, because Obsession is not a film about a monster you can easily identify and distance yourself from. It is a film about someone you recognize, someone familiar, which brings us to one of the most fascinating and least critically examined figures in modern discussions of gender and relationships, the nice guy. The nice guy is defined by his softness. He's someone who listens, someone who shows up. He doesn't pressure anyone. He doesn't raise his voice either. He isn't the kind of man we've been taught to fear. But beneath that softness often sits a very particular worldview. The nice guy believes that his goodness is a form of currency. His patience becomes an investment. His loyalty becomes an investment. His emotional suffering becomes an investment. And when something is an investment, like any other investment, he expects a return. The problem is that he rarely sees it this way. In his mind, he isn't entitled, he's just hurt. He isn't demanding anything, he's simply waiting for the universe to reward him for being good. But that's precisely what makes the dynamic so difficult to recognize. Because entitlement doesn't always announce itself through aggression. Sometimes it arrives disguised as disappointment. Sometimes it sounds like a heartbreak. Sometimes it looks like a man convincing himself that years of wanting someone have created a special claim over them. Parker starts showing this to us almost immediately. Early in the film, Bear's cat dies.
Shady? No. No.
We find him sitting on his bed crying, and on paper, this should be a scene about grief. But within moments, it becomes clear that the cat is not what occupies his emotional world. The conversation drifts almost immediately back towards Nikki, back towards the fact that she doesn't love him the way he loves her, back towards the feeling that something he desperately wants remains out of reach. And the scene reveals something important about Bear. His emotional life has become organized around a single absence. Everything bends back towards it. Every disappointment becomes another expression. So what follows after that is Bear goes into an antique shop and he picks up an object called the One Wish Willow and makes a wish. He wishes for Nikki to love him more than anyone else in the world.
I wish Nikki couldn't love me more than anyone in the fucking world.
Without her knowledge, without her consent, without any opportunity for her to choose otherwise. And what makes this moment so powerful is how ordinary the scene feels. The film doesn't frame it like a crime. There is no dramatic music, no monstrous transformation, and no obvious point where the audience is instructed to panic. Because Obsession understands something crucial. The most important violations rarely announce themselves as violations. They arrive disguised as reasonable desires, as understandable loneliness, as the actions of someone who believes they are acting out of love. Nothing visibly horrifying has happened yet. The film looks like it could still become a romance. The horror isn't visible as of now. But this is the moment where everything changes. Not when Nikki changes, not when the body horror starts happening, not when the consequences become impossible to ignore. Here, in the antique shop, with a man who was told exactly where the line was and he decided to cross it anyways. So what exactly did Bear do in that antique shop? He made a wish. Specifically, he wished for Nikki Freeman to love him more than anyone else in the world. And the wish was granted. Nikki now has overbearing feelings directed entirely at Bear. And from the outside, it looks like the romance in the film has finally clicked in and it is finally falling into place. But let us be precise about what actually happened. Bear did not ask Nikki. He did not tell anything to her. He did not give her any opportunity to say yes or no. He made a unilateral decision that she would love him. And then he implanted that desire into her without her knowledge. And then he also proceeded to receive the benefits of that love as though it was real, as though it was hers, as though she also had a part in that decision. That is consent violation, and the absence of a physical act does not change what it is. Consent is not just about the body in a narrow sense. It is about whether a person has the freedom and the information to make a genuine choice. Nikki has neither. She did not choose these feelings. She did not even know that a choice was being made. Bear removed that possibility entirely before she even had access to it. This is where the supernatural element of the film becomes extremely critical to understand correctly. The One Wish Willow is not what makes the story about violation. It is just the device that makes the violation visible. What Bear does with that object is something that happens in the real world constantly through coercion, through manipulation, through the slow erosion of someone's sense of self until they no longer know which of their feelings are genuinely their own. The magic just compresses it. It makes it immediate and impossible to look away from. to go deeper into why this specific act functions as an allegory for rape and sexual assault, because it is worth being thorough about this. When we talk about rape and sexual assault in legal and social terms, the conversation always almost centers around physical force. But feminist legal scholars and trauma researchers have spent decades arguing that physical force is actually not the defining element of sexual violation. The defining element is the removal of autonomy. It is the moment where one person decides that what they want matters more than what the other person has the right to choose. Physical force is simply the most visible and most legible way of enacting that removal, but it is not the only way. So what Bear does with the One Wish Willow is enacting that removal completely. He reaches inside Nikki's interior life, the most private, most sovereign space that a person has, the space where her feelings, her desires, her sense of self live, and he rewrites it without asking her, without her knowledge that it is even happening. He does not just take something away from her body, he takes something from her selfhood, he takes her ability to know her own mind. And this is precisely what survivors of certain forms of sexual violence and coercive control describe when they try to articulate what was done to them. Not just the physical act, but the feeling of having to be rewritten, of waking up and not recognizing your own response, of feeling things you do not understand, wanting things that you do not feel like yours, behaving in ways that feel foreign to who you know yourself to be. The violation does not stay in the moment it happened. It gets inside you. It tampers with the machinery of how you experience yourself. Nikki Freeman experiences exactly this. She wakes up and she wants Bear. And sometimes underneath that wanting, something in her knows that this is not right. The film shows this to us through small but significant details. The moments where she looks confused by her own feelings, where she seems to catch herself mid-sentence and not know how she got there.
I think you're drunk.
No, I'm not. Wait, what the fuck?
What the fuck? Are you okay?
I'm acting so weird.
Where something flickers behind her eyes that does not match the warmth she is performing. The real Nikki is already in there, already disoriented, already trying to locate herself inside the feelings that were never hers to begin with. But the most damaging thing the film does in this section is not show us what the wish does to Nikki. It shows us how Bear is receiving it. Because Bear knows. He knows these feelings were not there yesterday. He knows they did not come from her. He knows she did not choose this. And he accepts them anyway. He lets her look at him the way she does now. And he lets her say the things she now says to him and takes in all of it. Gratefully, relievedly, as though this is what he was owed all along. And that is the film's most precise and most devastating observation about this particular kind of man. Because Bear spent years telling anyone who would listen that he just wanted Nikki to be happy, that he cared about her, that his feelings came from a place of genuine love. But the moment he is given the option to have her compliance without her choice, he takes it without hesitation, without guilt. Because what he wanted was never really her. It was her directed at him. Whether that direction came from her or not was never the point. In 2024, a question went widely viral across social media. Women were asked that if you were alone in the woods, would you rather encounter a man or a bear? And overwhelmingly, women chose the bear, of course. The answers women gave when pressed to explain were not dramatic or hyperbolic. They were exhaustingly practical. A bear's intentions are legible. A bear does not have an agenda. A bear does not know your name, does not know where you live, does not feel entitled to your time or your body or your emotional labor. A bear is dangerous in ways you can understand and prepare for. A man, like many women said, is dangerous in ways that are harder to name and much harder to prove. And the film then proceeds to show you in meticulous detail exactly why the women who answered that question answered the way they did. Because Bear is not frightening on the surface. He is warm and familiar, and he means well, and he would never describe himself as someone capable of harm. And he reaches inside Nikki Freeman's mind without her consent and rewrites her sense of self to serve his own longing. The Bear in the Woods does not do that. The Bear in the Woods cannot rather do that. Hence, this is the film's most pointed cultural intervention. It is not just telling a story about one man and one woman. It is entering a conversation that millions of people have already been having about whether the men women are closest to, the men who care about them, the men who would be offended to be compared to a predator, are actually as safe as they believe themselves to be. Ben Bailey is the answer to that question dressed up in a horror film. He is the man women were thinking of when they said they would rather take the bear. And the wish, the act at the center of this film, the thing that looked like magic and functions like violation, is what happens when that man is finally given a mechanism that matches the scale of his entitlement. He does not hesitate, he does not wrestle with it. He makes the wish, pockets the broken object, and goes home to wait for Nikki to love him. This is who Bear is. That is what the name means, and that is why this film, underneath everything, is not a supernatural horror story. It is a portrayal of something that has always been very real. Now we need to talk about what this wish actually does to Nikki's body. Because this is where the film stops being a slow burn character study and becomes something genuinely difficult to watch. After the wish takes hold, Nikki begins to deteriorate, both emotionally and physically. She stands in corners for hours. She stands in the same spot for Bear's entire work shift, not moving, not eating, not drinking, urinating and defecating on herself, because her body has been so occupied and completely hijacked by this external devotion that its basic survival instincts have been overridden. She cannot leave, she cannot rest, she can only wait for him. Her body is no longer organized around her own needs, it is organized entirely around Bear. And then there is the dead cat sandwich. Nikki takes Bear's dead cat, puts it between his two slices of bread, and leaves it in his lunchbox with a note that says, "My little food critic." She does not know that she has done this. She would never choose to do it, but her body did it anyway because the wish had colonized her, not just her feelings, but also her actions, her instincts, her relationship with her own body. She is a tenant in her own flesh, a passenger in her own life. Barker films all of this not as villain horror but as tragedy. The camera does not position Nikki as a villain, as someone to be frightened of. It positions her as a person being destroyed from the inside by something that was put there without her permission. Every disturbing image in this section is the film asking you to grieve about her and not recoil from her. The film becomes genuinely interesting as a piece of social commentary, because as Nikki deteriorates, as her devotion becomes more consuming, more frightening, more impossible to be around, Bear starts to pull away. The thing he wished for has become too much. The obsession he manufactured is now terrifying him, and he begins to position himself as the victim of it. And that is one of the most precise and most uncomfortable things this film does, because Bear wanted devotion until devotion became frightening. He wanted to be the center of her universe until being the center of her universe became horrifying. He wanted her completely consumed by him and then recoiled the moment that consumption became ugly. This is not incidental to the film's argument. This is the argument, because what Bear is experiencing is something that plays out in real life relationships and in culture at large constantly. Society romanticizes the idea of a woman giving everything. A woman who is completely devoted, completely invested, completely consumed by the person she loves. This fact is like celebrated in songs, in films, in the language we use to describe romantic ideals. The woman who loves too much is not a cautionary tale in most cultural narratives. She is the goal. She is what love is supposed to look like when it is real. But the moment that that devotion transforms into something overwhelming, unstable, frightening, or inconvenient, people recoil from it. They treat it as though it appeared out of nowhere. They ask what is wrong with her rather than asking what created her. They make her the problem without ever interrogating the conditions that produced the problem. The tragedy of obsession is that the very thing that makes Nikki monstrous is the thing that was demanded of her. She became a nightmare because she was never allowed to remain human to begin with. And when she finally reached her most terrifying state, where she's creepy, violent, dissociated, and almost inhuman, the person who created this entire situation positions himself as the victim of it. Bear, who made the wish, who accepted its benefits, who knew exactly what he had done, now looks at what Nikki has become and is frightened by her. The monster he has made is now his problem to escape. This is also where the film introduces one of the most devastating details. The destruction does not stop at her own body, it starts spreading outwards. Nikki begins hurting herself physically, visibly in ways which are deeply devastating and distressing. And then there is Sarah. Sarah is Nikki's friend, someone she would have never harmed in a normal case scenario. But Sarah decided to flirt with her boyfriend Bear, and Nikki kills her. Not because she wanted to, not because she chose to. Her body, operating under the total occupation of Bear's wish, commits an act of violence against someone Nikki would have done everything to protect. This is the film at its most brutal and most honest, because what Barker is showing us here is the full cost of what Bear did in that antique shop. It was never going to stay contained to the two of them. It was never going to be a private arrangement between a man and the woman whose autonomy he decided to override. The violation spread. It used Nikki's hands, Nikki's body, Nikki's face to destroy the people she loved the most. And she did not pull away from Sarah either. This is what the literature on coercive control tells us consistently, that the damage is never limited to the primary relationship. It radiates outwards. It touches friendships, family, work, identity. The person being controlled becomes, in many cases, an instrument of harm against the very people they love, because the control has severed them from their own judgment, their own values, their own sense of who they are and what they would and would not do. Nikki Freeman would not have hurt Sarah, but Nikki Freeman was not the one in the room, and Bear, who made this possible, who set every single one of these dominoes in motion with one selfish and unexamined act, is being frightened, feeling victimized, trying to figure out how to make it stop without ever fully reckoning with the fact that he is the reason it started. The film gives us a woman covered in the consequences of someone else's desire, and it gives us the man who created those consequences slowly realizing that what he built is too big for him to live with, not because he has developed a conscience, but because it has become inconvenient. The distinction matters enormously. Bear does not want to undo the wish because he understands what he has done to Nikki. He wants to undo it because the version of Nikki that he wished he produced is no longer serving him. So this gives us an idea that she was never a person to him. She was a feeling he was trying to secure. And when the feeling curdled into something he could not manage, he was done with it. She became the monster he wanted. She lost everything in the process of becoming it. And she will be the one left standing in the wreckage when it is over. There is one scene in Obsession that I keep thinking about. It is when the real Nikki surfaces. Not the entity Bear's wish created, and not the devoted, deteriorating, dangerous version of her that has been occupying her body, but Nikki, the actual person. And the first thing she does while sleeping is beg Bear to kill her.
Please don't wake her up. Just kill me.
She is not being dramatic, she is not having a breakdown. She is making a completely rational request from someone who has been trapped inside her own body, watching herself commit acts of violence she would have never done, using people she loved, being used as an instrument of someone else's desire for so long that death feels like the only form of freedom that is still available to her. She is asking for exit while she still can. And Bear's response to this woman begging him to end her suffering, a suffering he is entirely responsible for, is to look at her and say, "What is so bad about being with me?" That line is the film. That single sentence contains everything Obsession has been building towards across its entire runtime. Because in that moment, faced with the full and undeniable reality of what he has done to Nikki, faced with a woman who would rather die than continue existing in the life he manufactured for her, Bear's first instinct is not remorse. It is not horror at himself. It is not even a genuine question. It is an appeal to his own feelings, a request for reassurance. A man who has just been shown the complete devastations his actions have caused and whose immediate response is to make it about whether he is enough. It is the nice guy in his purest and most devastating form. Still, even here, even now, centering himself, still unable to look at Nikki and see a person whose suffering exists independently of his own narrative about it. He does not ask what he can do for her. He asks whether being loved by him is so terrible, as though that is the only relevant question, as though that has ever been the point. This is entitlement at its most naked, not aggressive, not cruel in any way he would recognize as cruelty, just a man who cannot, even at the very end, locate himself as the cause of what he is looking at. At the end of the film, he swallows a number of pills, deciding to end himself, and he dies. And the moment he does, the wish breaks, the curse is lifted, and Nikki Freeman comes back to herself. She wakes up surrounded by bodies. Sarah is dead, Ian is dead. Her hands are covered in blood from acts she has no memory of committing. She is holding a gun she does not remember picking up. The life she had before Bear made his wish, her friendships, her sense of self, her relationship with her own body and her own mind is gone. And she is the one left standing in the middle of it all with Bear lying dead in her arms, which means she is the one who will have to answer for all of it. The film ends on her screaming, not on Bear's death, not on the breaking of the curse, on Nikki. On the sound of a woman returning to consciousness inside a life that has been completely destroyed in her name by someone else's hands and discovering all at once what that destruction looks like. She is looking at a triple homicide. She will be the one charged with all of it. She will be the one who has to find a language for what happened in a world that does not have a legal category for what Bear did. She will be the one who has to live inside a body that was used as a weapon against people she loved and carry that knowledge for the rest of her life. Bear is dead. His suffering is over. Hers is just beginning. And this is the final and most important thing Obsession says, that the real victim of the story was never Bear. Not when Nikki's devotion frightened him, not when the consequences of his wish became too large for him to manage, not when she became something he could no longer recognize as the girl he loved. Bear was never the victim. He was the architect. He could not survive what he built. Nikki is the one who has to. Title of the film is Obsession, and most people who watch it assume that the title refers to Nikki, who is the terrifying one, all-consuming devotion that takes all over her body and destroys everything around her. But I want to suggest that the title was never hers. The obsession in this film belongs to Bear. His obsession with being chosen, his obsession with Nikki as an object of his longing rather than a person with her own interior life, his obsession with securing her love at any cost, including hers. Nikki did not become obsessed. Nikki was obsessed over. And there is a profound difference between those two things, a difference the film understands even when its title seems to obscure it. She was not the obsession, she was the cause of one. Hi everybody, I am Omba from The Life Factory, and I hope that you liked and enjoyed my video. If you did, please consider subscribing. That would help me a lot. And I will see you in the next video once again. Bye.